And I think we are live. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone who is listening and joining this webinar live right now. Welcome to the Society for People Analytics webinar. And we are here with an incredibly exciting, boring, pick your pick. It's a pretty diversified area on this one in terms of talking about technology and data architecture as it pertains to people analytics. So first and foremost, I'd love to ask everyone to do me a quick favor and do a tech check for me. If you are joining us on LinkedIn right now, please let us know where you are dialing in from, your role in the people analytics ecosystem, as well as how you would explain your job to a fifth grader, just for fun. And also just to make sure that we are actually live on LinkedIn as we speak. So with all that said, I love to introduce you to my panel of esteemed guests, if you will, as we kind of dive into the topic about data and technology architecture. So folks, we are going to go around the room and introduce ourselves. I would start with your name, how you would explain your job to a fifth grader, and what was the moment that made you realize data and tech architecture actually mattered for people analytics? Because I feel like we all had that one moment in our analytics careers where we kind of slapped our forehead and said, like, dope, yeah, I should have done that earlier. So with that said, Angela, I'm going to start with you. Charlie, I'm going to move to you, and then Justin, we will wrap up with you.
So start with me?
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Angela. I'm currently Chief AI Officer of People Alchemy, which is my startup. And if I had to describe my job to a fifth grader, I think effectively what I would say is that I help companies tell the truth with their data. And then I help people listen to that truth. So I think that's probably the easiest and simplest way I describe my work to a fifth grader. And I think and the other question was,
when did you realize data architecture actually mattered in people analytics?
yeah, I think it's probably the fifth or sixth time someone is shouting at you because the data is wrong or a number doesn't align to something they're seeing. You're not sure why because you're looking at it and you've spent so much time on it. And then you start to sort of realize, oh, something isn't connected. There's multiple sources of truth. And then you start to have a lot of conversations with tech folks and realize that, oh, certain things aren't integrated. And then suddenly you just start to kind of discover the importance of why data architecture and pipelines are really meaningful. So I think for me, it's the fifth or sixth time that I'm showing up with something that just wasn't landing. Finally penetrated.
Fair enough. Carly, what about yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. Super excited to be here. I work at Hyatt Hotels Corporation, and I lead our leadership development and org effectiveness group. So, among a number of things, the best way to describe my role is we oversee talent end to end, support our colleague listening programs, and different performance capabilities. And so, for me, this conversation is exciting because we do a lot of work in colleague listening and understanding impact there. How would I describe my role to, what do we say, a 5-year-old, fifth grader?
Fifth grader.
Okay. Maybe the same answer though. I just help people ensure they feel good about coming into work and that what they're doing in their jobs is fulfilling. And how did I know that infrastructure was important? Maybe similar to Angela, it took me a few maybe questions along the way, but largely it was those moments of not just data that we were delivering, but hearing all the time from customers like, where else can we learn? What can we do? And then you're pulling, my favorite word that we use internally is like our employee files, because the back end is always never as clean as we all hope it to be. But I think it's digging in and really just understanding like the closet doors can be shut, but there's like a whole mess behind that. So like we need a Marie Kondo our lives. And like until I understood like the pain of carrying all of those like messiness and how that influences where we're able to provide insights, I think is really where that came through. So shared data infrastructure trauma in helping support our customers and clients throughout my career.
I love that. And last but not least, Justin.
Hello, I'm the Senior Manager of People Data and Governance at Adobe. And my job is to keep things organized so that we can make sure everyone's able to do their best work and have a good time at work so they can be more productive. And I realized it was really important to keep things organized. I actually, as coming from the other direction, from the back end, I was a software engineer building tools, and I realized that importance of keeping things organized was really high, because it's easy to lose track if you have multiple copies of stuff and there are a lot of things changing all the time. So if you build it right, you can make it so that when you change one thing, it's changed everywhere you need it to be changed, and you can find it easily. So I try to maintain that for all the people I'm working with, and for myself, because it's easy to get lost in my own work.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I totally forgot to introduce myself. So for folks out there who has not seen my face yet floating around the SPA webinars, hi, Lydia Wu, Technology Chair for SPA, as well as the creator behind Whoops, Did I Think That Out Loud? And I will say my most traumatizing moment, and I can literally pinpoint that moment, was way back when, years ago, when a talent acquisition leader looked me dead in the eye and said, Lydia, we got to build a talent acquisition funnel. I want to know where we're losing all the candidates. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh, okay, cool. That's great. And then I'm like, what data do we have? Well, guess what? When we implemented our ATS, we never staged the entire funnel. All we know is who came in and who exited. There was no gaps or stage labels along the way. So now we have 5 years worth of data that I'm supposed to build a funnel from without actually knowing where everyone entered and exited the entire process. So that was my sort of trauma moment when it came to like, actually, hang on, I think we need to think about the architecture before we start doing the work. So speaking of the architecture, I do think the very, very first thing before we even start architecting the data or the technology behind people analytics, we need to talk about how do we structure the problem? How do we know that we are building an infrastructure that is just for what we need it and not over engineering the infrastructure itself? So question out to everyone here is, what should a well thought out problem look like in people analytics? That doesn't sound anything like, hey, we should just do people analytics and go figure out how to do people analytics. Whoever wants to start.
Yeah. I can get us started. For me, I mean, we actually like referenced a little bit of this in like our intros of like the pain points. We started with like a business problem, right? So I think the why does this matter? It's starting also with like understanding like why and what are we trying to solve for in the business context. So really getting underneath that. So like Lydia, as your example, you're like, I want to look at a talent funnel. Okay, well, like why? Like why is that important and why does that matter? Whether it's the outcome of that or any point, like are you losing certain candidates along the way that have high value return into the business? Like, what is that looking like for you? And so, for example, at us, so at Hyatt, we lean a lot on the customer side. So you stay at our hotels, you have a guest experience. We obviously want you to have a good stay. And so when we think about our colleague data, and as you can imagine, we have a lot of business leaders coming to us of, yeah, why are people leaving, or why are they frustrated, or what could we do better? We want to understand like that why a little bit more. And from the guest perspective, it might be maybe I'm checking in and the guest isn't getting the right service that they're looking for or the information that they need during their stay. Well, can we pull that guest insight to then say, let's pull it back into, well, are colleagues getting the training they need? Are they getting the support from their leaders to be able to have time to answer those types of questions? Those are things we can listen to. So instead of just, hey, I need like my colleague data, I need to know what's going on. You're like, well, why does that matter to you? And so I'm picking maybe one in our industry just to make a point, but to really understand the why, I think helps us then pull back the what are we looking for in the solution, which then backs into like, well, how do we have the structure to actually enable to be able to have the solution or insight to drive the business result?
Yeah, and just to off of that, I think, a lot of times it's basically, like Carly is mentioning, it's really trying to figure out, what is the footprint or what's the journey of a particular employee or a group of employees or a cluster, and trying to work out, well, what is it that you want to know? Is it about how they make decisions, how they're moving through the organization? Is it trying to figure out what their experience is like? And so really just breaking down those pieces, as you were describing earlier with your talent funnel. So, what's the experience that talent is going through in different situations that then helps you to figure out sort of from a data perspective, like, okay, so how would I capture that? What would it look like? In what form? How regular is it? And then you start to sort of go down a bit of a journey to figure out, well, is it realistic to capture all of that? And how do I connect it as they move through? Because I think we've all had the experience of, the time series dynamics with data is not always so straightforward. So I think those are the elements that helps you sort of define the problem statement, because all those steps might not be important, but you might identify a critical step within that where you say, okay, well, I don't need to know all, but step number 3 and 12 are really important for me to make sure I capture because they're pivotal in how other aspects of a process may play out. So
So, Angela, can I just double click into that response for 2 seconds? You said it's about turning into the steps that actually matter, like understanding where you need to capture the data. Typically, kind of take us through how would you take a problem statement, like I'm going to pick on the talent funnel one again, of something like I need to build a talent funnel. How would you step by step break that down so that you know how and when and where to capture the data?
So I think what I would do is, like, again, I'd be sitting down with those particular stakeholders and to describe, okay, well, this talent funnel that we're describing, what's the beginning of that? When does it start? How do you know this process is starting? And then to your point, okay, how do we know that we're moving along? And typically, because there's documentation involved in different steps, there's usually some critical aspect that lets you know you've moved from point A to point B. So really mapping that out in like great clarity, identifying what system typically captures it. And in some cases, if it's manual, marking that down so that we understand that, okay, so that's where I'm going to have, a pretty interesting experience later down the line, given that it's manual and everyone might be capturing it differently. But really, like, once you sort of nail down all those kind of manual steps, or all those, sorry, not manual steps, but all those individual steps and the systems, then you start to look at it and say, well, where's the decision point here that's the most important for whatever it is I'm trying to do? Because it really depends on also the goal when you're looking at it of sort of an end-to-end process, right? Is your goal automation, or is your goal improving some aspect of the experience? So I think for me, it's breaking it down into pieces, decomposing that into sort of chunks that you can work with, and then identifying areas that you want to work on or make improvements on.
Gotcha. That's super helpful.
Can I add to that from an
to add?
engineering
Yeah.
side?
Yeah.
So I love everything I'm hearing here because it's great to understand the overall picture before you jump in and look for those point solutions that you're mentioning. Because the engineering side can then take that big picture and make decisions about the architecture to enable future questions about the process. And it's easy to get yourself trapped and painted into a corner if you focus on the point solutions first and then realize you need to re-architect something in order to get to the answers to similar questions that are from a different perspective. So I'm really happy. I endorse like fully what Carly and Angela are saying here.
So I'm going to double click on that one as well, because I think a lot of times what people analytics practitioners struggle with is when they're being told that, hey, I need you to solve this problem today, this 2-year-old recurring problem that really, really sucks. But you need to be able to solve it, Justin, to your point, in a very future-proof kind of way. Can you just kind of give us a few tactical perspectives in terms of how do you keep that future-proof mindset in mind while you're designing a solution for today?
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that. So I always joke with my teams that they need to think about and then what. In fact, I want it on my tombstone, and then what? Because whatever you're doing right now, if you don't think about what's next, then you're going to find yourself potentially in a really tough situation where you have to undo what you just did, or rebuild it, or explain why something that wasn't right the first time. And that could be simple things like, what are you going to do with this information once I give it to you? Are you going to ask another question? Are you going to make a decision? What's that going to be? And I found that like some people I worked with in recruiting said once that their status quo was chaos. And the best thing you can do is learn to support chaos, because things are always changing. And the best thing I've told people to learn about future proofing is there is no future proofing. It's always going to be changing. And if you can accommodate for that with an architecture that can adjust accordingly, then you're better off than building like the perfect thing that's very rigid, because it won't be perfect in a few months.
Yeah. I loved Justin, something you said in there, which is like sort of the behavior change part of it. Like, what are you going to do as a result of what we're going to learn? And maybe that question's too broad. And so maybe it's something more like, okay, if I did everything you just said, like, what does that look like for you then in practice? And have them kind of like walk through, like, well, you're going to have a meeting. Are you going to like go talk to people? So I think it's taking what you're saying, because I totally agree with you. And and then like trying to think about that. And then how do you simplify it even further? Because sometimes even in asking that question, people are like, well, I mean, I'm going to have better business results. I'll like make people happy and I'll know what I'm doing now. And all that's great because I want to be able to do that. And I think the behavior change, the shift, like what are you expecting out of this, I think is so key. So just underscoring that, maybe adding like some other questions that we ask when going into that level.
So
Yeah.
Carly, actually, oh, Angela, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I just kind of in addition to all that, I think, getting into the whole impact feasibility conversation becomes really important because to all kind of all the points raised, it's like if the impact really isn't going to be sizable, and the feasibility also then kind of affects a little bit of like, well, is it going to be worth all of the pain point? It's kind of like, yeah, it could be interesting, but if the impact is only going to affect maybe like 15, 20 users versus let's say a couple thousand users, that really plays out in terms of like the importance of the effort, and also the value that you're going to bring to the table, because value creation is at the end of the day the goal, right? So
For sure.
Yeah.
I will say let's definitely put a pin on the impact feasibility assessment, because I feel like a lot of analytics practitioners will need to think about that the next time they're asked for another iteration of a report or a dashboard that's just a little bit nuanced and a little bit different than the last one that we're all looking at. So Carly, I want to go back to you for 2 hot seconds, because
Sure.
you talked about getting stakeholders to the problem, meaning help them digest the problem instead of having them come to you and say like, hey, I have this thing, it kind of sucks. And you're asking like, okay, what about it? And they're like, well, it just sucks. I just want better business results. How do you guide stakeholders to have that under the hood conversation where you really are able to diagnose their needs and kind of quantify that into different pieces of work for your team?
Yeah. Well, I love the question. I actually think, not to open the can of worms that you just tried to close on us around like the bringing
Keep
people
going.
on the next iteration. Because I think it starts here, right? It's having that like shared understanding of where we're beginning and like how that value is realized. And I don't know if this is a metaphor that will relate to everyone, but as we've been chatting, I've been thinking about the movie Moneyball, which is about the story of a baseball team, and they're trying to like improve their outcomes, which in baseball terms is like we want to win the World Series. And if anyone is a sports person or understands stats, like people can get wild about those things. Like evaluate like the blade of the grass in which that impacts the shoe of which the run that you're making in the outfield to deliver the catch in which you're making the play. Right? You can get really, really complicated, as we do in organizations. Help me solve for the blade of grass. Okay, but what are we really trying to solve here? So in the Moneyball example is about like just simplifying it, getting it to runs. How do we get people to runs? And they started there. And to your question, in that example, and I think what we see in a lot of organizations is there's pushback, right? You're not seeing maybe the same type of data or the same like storytelling or sexiness that you're like looking for as the end result. But if you start with if you spend the time with that stakeholder, understand like what are the runs for us? What is the behavior change? So in hotel term, that just might be like, are you seeing more confidence in the person in the front desk? Are they cleaning rooms more effectively? Do you see that in the data when guests respond to us? How do you get to that like core small thing so that you can begin together? And I think ultimately that gets to results. For us, that's good guest service and good and happy colleagues. For Moneyball, that's about getting runs and eventually sort of like winning the series. But I think it ties into good stakeholder management, really getting under the hood, under the why. And Lydia, to your closed topic, but I think helping with the iterations down the road, because we've been clear on that first step and the value realization, potentially on the way to something bigger, but at least we have shared understanding and confidence and wins together.
Yeah, makes total sense. Angela, just anything else to add there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I agree. I mean, I think, when we're having conversations around just sort of value, I think it's working out all the elements and all the pieces around how we get there. And I think that's exactly what Carly's kind of describing. I think so. If you forget that, then the discussion can kind of go off the rails and you can find yourself in detail and minutia. But if you can kind of center it on a little bit as like, okay, well, what's really important here and what really matters and what's the value that we're trying to create, then I think it helps keep everyone honest in those discussions when it could easily go off into something else.
Yeah.
And you might get something surprising if you ask for what you really want. Maybe the team you're working with has a way to do something that you thought was impossible. Or maybe they don't, but you can get something that's good enough. And you being creative, you can use a proxy metric or like a highly correlated. I know it gets tricky, and you might want to talk to a data scientist to like validate what you're doing. But there's a lot that creativity can get you in these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add one word too on Justin's point around good enough? We spend a lot of time actually on our team talking about good enough, or sort of like just kind of sitting within the context of the business versus, we'll call it insight perfect. Because sometimes good enough, I have found when we go out with good enough, they're like, oh, that's great. That like helps us out perfectly. Like that gets us started. Or like, thank you so much. This is the best thing ever. right? In all of our roles, like we all want to be so good at our jobs that like we are our own worst critics and our own like most difficult reviewer. So sometimes like our good enough is like they're perfect and beyond and like shooting for the stars. So I think also give ourselves credit on like the parts and pieces along the way. Now there's also other value to that, which is checking to understand and kind of continue to build. But Justin, I'm so glad that you said that because we spend a lot of time like within our own team culture when we talk about value and partnering that the good enough is great.
And it
Yeah,
helps you
for sure.
capture problems early. Like if the
Yeah.
approach isn't good, but you're iterating quickly, then you can
Yeah.
adjust your course more easily than if you spend months going down the wrong path.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick shout out to the audience who are listening to us on LinkedIn right now through the live events. If you do have any questions for the panelists, feel free to pop them in the comments. We will get to those. And yes, this is a live event. We're not pre-recorded or anything else along those lines. So I'm going to kind of take us to the meat of the topic today, which is the idea of tech architecture and data architecture. A lot of times we talk about the two things as if they're one and the same, and they do impact each other. But I think in reality, it's two completely separate concepts altogether. So I think let's break that down for our audiences for a moment here. This is out to everyone. What, in your perspective, is the role of technology architecture and people analytics, and vice versa? How does people analytics and how can people analytics practitioners influence or impact technology architecture decisions in their organization? Whoever wants to start.
I can jump in here. Oh, sorry, Angela, you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I think that it's first and foremost to enable. We need to be able to capture this data, enable processes, and analyze it to make sure it's working well. And its other primary purpose, I think, is to do that safely, like making sure that privacy is respected, that compliance is achieved, that we delete data we don't need anymore, we don't collect information we're not going to need because there's a possibility of a leak or something like that, or misuse. So that's my perspective is it should do those things. And sometimes you use tools that are designed from the get-go to enable processes that are familiar to what you're about to try to achieve. And sometimes you're using something that wasn't really built for that to begin with, and you have to, again, get creative with it. And it doesn't mean that you're in the wrong one if you don't have one that was purpose-built. It might actually be more flexible to enable other paths. So yeah, like if we get back to before, like explaining what you're trying to do, you can find a good tool. And even a tool that may not be the right tool can actually get you the right results.
Yeah, for sure. Angel?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think when I'm describing this to sort of like non-techies or individuals that are just trying to get their head around why we're even here, it's kind of like the pipes and kind of the water dynamic, right? And you're basically saying like you're trying to tell a story, but muddy water, unclear water, not drinkable, not usable, kind of really basic sort of visuals like that help people to understand why you need to care, right? Why you need to be bothered. And to Justin's point, if it's not safe, if it's not connected to something broader, there's a mechanism for maintaining that cleanliness. So, it helps people understand why it's important to have these conversations, why we need to be plugged in, why sometimes you need more pipes or more containers to hold things because you want to experiment with something and you don't want to muddy all of the water. You need a bit of a sandbox situation. So I think all of those kind of narratives help people to really understand what we're attempting, especially if you're getting into the space where you're building data models or you're building AI models and you want to sort of apply a logic to data that isn't necessarily inherent to that particular data set. You need to explain why it can't be live data, why it needs to be something separate, right? So I think all of that is where it starts to get a little bit helpful as people start to understand why these kind of the messier techie side of the discussion is still very much part of this other people side and the softer side. And because all those things come together. And I think it's always like that qualitative balance. Both equally powerful worlds. You just have to appreciate that they kind of need each other and they're kind of supporting each other. So that's the way I try to describe it as to why it's something of interest, as opposed to that's not my problem. Let tech do that. Or when you're talking about certain narratives, like, oh, that's a finance thing. And I'm like, no, that's us. That's definitely us. So, yeah.
For sure. Carly?
And I would add, so in my role, we are partners with technology, and then we're customers of also not just the tech, but we'll call it like the data that comes out of that. And so your question was, right, how do you influence or support or kind of work through that? And so maybe 2 points of view. What we try to bring as a team or think about is because we are both customers and sort of, or I should say, and also leading in how we provide a service to the organization, how can our team, one, articulate the pain points or the needs in ways that also matter to our tech partner, not just matter to our tech partners, but also help them in their role? And also, because we're interfacing with the business, how do we also help serve as the voice of the business? Like our general managers in hotels, these are things that they need. How can we help share those things so that as you're making data or technology infrastructure decisions, whether that's new tech, updated tech, changes, how do we sort of support a good seat at the table around those things? And then the other part I'll bring up, just in terms of depending on where people sit in their career, is like if you're leading also your function, how do you listen to your team and bring those points to bear, right? We talked earlier about in our intros of like, how did you know that this was like where it was your first like moment of this matters? Well, if you're leading your team, you may not be in the pain as much as you once were. And so how do you really listen to your team to understand, to then bring those to the table to have the discussion? And then the last point I'll make, which is if you are driving the work, how can you get really clear about the 1, 2, maybe 3 things that matter most from that infrastructure perspective that you can share with your leader or your stakeholders to continue to be a champion for the impactful work? So kind of a range there depending on your seat, but that's kind of some of the things that we think about.
Absolutely. And I do want to go back to Angela's illustration or example of like the pipes for a second, because I think a lot of people analytics practitioners are probably scarred, if not traumatized, by the word integration every time you're trying to pull data through or you're trying to pipe data somewhere. And I think the perfect illustration to me of why tech architecture matters is integration gets wonky when you try to hook a stainless steel pipe with a plastic PVC pipe, and the diameters of those pipes don't match. So now you're duct taping and super gluing and trying to figure out how to get that water to flow or whatever liquid to flow. And effectively, that's why tech architecture matters, because you don't want to be the one duct taping the middle with manual reports, essentially. So
I want to
with
restate
that said,
my job to a
yes.
fifth grader. That's it. That's it. The duct tape.
Yes, we're the duct tape. We make that happen. It just rolls and rolls of colored duct tape. So with that in mind, I do want to pivot a little bit, and I think we will answer the question from our audience here as well with this question here, which is, what is the role of data architecture then? So if we think about tech architecture as like the infrastructure or the piping that has to happen in the back end, what the heck is data architecture in relation to that? What does that look like?
Oh my God, I have to jump in because I have a funny story with this. So we were in a bunch of meetings where we were talking about migrating data. So there's data in a platform A, and we just want elements of it in platform B. And everyone's clear about what that looks like. And we're already talking about what platform B looks like and what needs to flow through. And there's an assumption we're making that everyone understands how you're describing it as it goes through the systems, right? And so you're just assuming it's like going to be this two-way dynamic, right? And then you get to the end of the other side of it. And for some reason, there's like, I don't know, a very simple file that was describing it. But next thing, what you realize is the data tables that we needed were not properly articulated. It didn't flow through. And so you had a situation where at the end of it, parts of the data are in the new platform, not all of it. And you think, well, how could that be? How could it have missed? And you start to realize there's an issue with data labeling and all these other dynamics. And so anyway, I describe that example because where that's not a tech issue, the pipe is there, right? It's we didn't have all the right things flowing through. And so you're now in this environment where you're like, oh, half of the things that I need to pull from the system isn't actually available. I still have to go to the second one. This MVP is not really MVP. This is now more manual. Okay. So that's effectively, I mean, I have dozens of experiences like this. And you turn to your data person, and then somehow down the line, there's a handoff that didn't play out. So for me, the whole data architecture part of the conversation is multiple databases, multiple sort of systems that have data structured a certain way. Because they're different systems, the labeling isn't always the same, right? And so someone has to make sure that all the water elements or all the liquid elements are flowing through. And the architecture is how you design for that. And somehow, in this wonderful world that we live in, that's the part that gets missed. And so you blame the system and you go, oh, this is wrong with the tech. And you're just like, no, this is the data situation. This is back to now just data. So don't know if that helps.
So what I'm hearing is don't mislabel sewage and drinking water pipes in the house is effectively how data architecture plays into this.
That'd be terrible, yes. If that was actually coming into your faucet as opposed to the bathroom, yes, that would be bad.
Justin or Carly, anything to add there?
That's a great way to put it. And I think even just labeling the same water or something else, like in our system we call it H2O, and like, okay, now I need to keep that in mind every time I do an analysis. I need to relabel it. I think if you can eliminate all that by getting rid of one-offs and caveats and speaking a common language across all the systems, then all those like integration points become simpler, and you can worry about bigger, better problems. So a data architecture, like someone asked, how do you scale? That's one way, is you eliminate all those differences, because even the smartest people you work with are going to have to juggle all these like nomenclature changes, and like, oh, in this report we filter out this kind of person, but in this one we don't. Like if you can just not do that and make it really prominent, remind everyone every time they're looking at your data what they're looking at, by keeping it simple so you don't have to have caveats, and also by just showing like we filtered this group out for this purpose of this analysis, instead of having it be like a hidden fact that only a certain person on the team knows, but they're on vacation. And then I think to adjust over time, like you mentioned that changes are happening really often, keep things modular and interchangeable. Like if at some point you're going to switch to system B, um, hopefully it keeps things labeled the same way. So and you can just rip that data set out and put the new one in, and it's pretty much the same plus a few new things that you need, instead of like totally redoing everything you have in place. And you can do that by speaking in terms of how the business talks about it, not necessarily about how the tool you're using talks about it. Because most tools that aren't custom built have their own naming and kind of customs for things, and that's okay. But if it doesn't match what your company does because they have their own language, use the company language, and it just keeps it that much simpler. Less juggling.
For sure. I think that's one part of implementation a lot of people miss, which is when you plug a platform in, you're actually allowed to relabel this stuff. You don't have to call it whatever the product team has decided to call it previously.
Yep.
Sorry, Carly, go ahead.
No. I think that's a good one, and also a good one to ask about too, because there's, to your point on the relabeling, maybe this more sits on the like tech side, but like what also implications does that have down the road? So like I think also asking the questions, so it's like a yes and component on that. I share that just because we're actually in the middle of also like we're doing some configuring, we're doing some data, we're doing some tech. So a strong theme you'll hear from me today is a lot from like the customer perspective. So like for us, that could be business customer, that could also be a lot of our internal customers, right? We work in HR, we serve all our business units. And so when I think about the data integrity piece or cleanup or ensuring those, we have that all, in order, I think it really, for me, comes back to using those moments when we're trying to solve that business opportunity to also start to build stewards of why it's important to keep things clean or organized, because we have so many stakeholders that own different parts of, in our case, like I'll call like our employee data. And so, for example, like we talked about changes, Hyatt's gone through a lot of acquisitions over the past several years. If you follow our brand, you'll see that. And so if we're reporting and supporting people insights, and we're acquiring organizations that have those different labelings or a different understanding of what an employee is, or what tenure, how we're tracking tenure. I'm just naming a couple of easy things. Well, then back to the insights, we're not able to get insights that then drive business decisions. And so what I find our team doing often is in those moments, using it to educate folks. Like, here's what we're able to pull today, but here's where I could use your support in ensuring we can like clean things up as we move forward. Some of it is the infrastructure on the back end, right? But I think still having champions at senior levels all the way down to the team levels is key. So I think that's like the part that we lean on as it relates to this question, kind of like where do we go with like how to solve for it? It's helping bring advocates in with you and understand like where that's coming from, because often your partner or your customer is obviously being impacted by what you can, as we've been saying, stitch together. But we don't want to be stitching. We want to like have good source data. So that's where I would go. How do you leverage your partners to help tell the story with you and to help solve with you? Because then we can be advocates. And I'll go back to our acquisition example. When we started acquiring, we saw a ton of mismatch of information. There wasn't a lot of passion around keeping things clean other than the teams behind the team. But when we started asking questions of like, oh, of the acquired companies, like where are people like leaving? Well, when we don't have like the labels and the clean and to understand that, then that becomes like a shared, oh, we should do something with that. And so now we've seen that start to turn. So there is hope. And I think it's just bringing advocates along with you.
So what I'm hearing is make your problem a little bit bigger, so it's someone else's problem, so collectively you can solve it together in the name
Listen,
of people
it's a
analytics.
shared problem. We all want the same thing. We want people to love where they work, and we want our guests to be happy. So yes, we do have the same outcomes for sure. We're all in
Yeah,
it together.
definitely. So Justin, this is a question. I hear ya. Justin, this is a question from the audience. It's also my next question to you, coincidentally. So this kind of like my stars aligning as a moderator. As a software engineer by trade, now working with people data and talking to HR, I can definitely pinpoint the moments of like my early career where I'm sitting in the room with IT and I'm looking at them thinking to myself, I understand the English that's coming out of your mouth. I have no idea what you're actually saying to me. How can HR and IT teams work better together, communicate better together when it comes to people analytics goals?
Yeah, I think that goes both ways. When people in different specialties talk, they may not understand the nuance or even the gist of what's going on. And I would say sometimes like talk about it like you're talking to your parents, like people who like know you and love you but don't understand you all the way sometimes. like it's if you can make it simpler and then come together, it can help a lot. And that's you can do that from somebody in the same team or somebody in a different team. I've seen sometimes people are embedded. Like right now, I'm embedded in the HR group as an engineer, which is really cool. I've also been in a separate engineering group working with HR, but in both cases, tying my goals to the business goals and being held accountable for them, I think is going to guarantee success better than like having two totally separate roadmaps. And you can do that by explaining what you're trying to do, like we mentioned earlier, and also being open to new ideas, which I think I mentioned before too. Like if you explain that you have a recruiting funnel, somebody who's in data who may not have worked on a recruiting funnel before might think, oh, I've worked on a sales funnel or a manufacturing process, and I can apply the same things here, even though it's a totally different subject area. And if you're open to using some of those tricks, you might find that you can do something that you thought was impossible before or never would have thought of before. And yeah, I think those are my main tips. Like establish a common language, ask people if they understand, and really test that they do, because sometimes people will say they understand because they don't want to admit that they don't. But it's actually like the people that come to me and say they don't understand that end up understanding the best because you can explain it to them more fully that way.
And I would
Yeah.
probably also add that don't try to do each other's job. I think of it in a lot of meetings where you've got HR folks who are like, oh, I know what this needs to look like. And so they're very prescriptive to tech. And then you've got tech folks who are like, oh, I know what that is. This is, and so I think what ends up happening is both sides end up sort of diluting the impact, right? Versus I think if you sort of show up and you're like, look, I am trying to get a particular outcome. This is what I would like, right? Stick to the sort of space of requirements. You allow tech to then show up and kind of say, okay, given our environment, this is what it looks like. And then vice versa, if tech is able to kind of say, okay, well, what is it that you're really trying to land with employees or with, a particular group of people? What is the experience? What's the outcome you'd like? And then you kind of get into a better conversation around, okay, here's what I'm trying to enable, like you mentioned earlier, Justin, for HR. And so I just think sometimes what I've seen is when both sides show up with a bit more of sort of like curiosity and just not trying to do the other person's role, I think you get to a better place because you do get like the right amount of creative tension as opposed to watered down versions of someone's giving you half baked requirements or you have a loose idea of what you think the experience needs to be and then it sort of just doesn't land.
That's so good. And you can take pieces of everyone's ideas to build like a super idea that's better than any individual idea. And you only get there if you have that open conversation about, and you can ask, you can prompt it too. Like, oh, I recommend that we use this tool. We can't use that tool here, unfortunately. But what do you like about that tool? Because maybe we can find those features or enhance this one that we have to do that. And yeah, that collaboration is ultimately, I think, going to build the best possible solution that probably no individual on the team knows.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's Kari, go ahead.
Oh no, I mean I love all those things. The only other thing I would like add, because it truly is yes, yes, yes. Add would be like also maybe peeling back a little bit of the why, because I think sometimes in the curiosity, the brainstorming, the getting to, we have different whys. Like in our case, like the business coming to the table. Like I want to be able to explain like here's what's happening with the teams and departments. Here's what the business leader asked me. Here's how we're thinking about things. And like why I was curious to come to you. I can't wait to hear your expertise. Like here's where we're challenged. And then for the tech team to be able to do the same, like, here's what we have available to us. Here's where we're testing things. Here's where I have some limitations. Here's what I'm excited about. So kind of just also peeling back into the individual why, I think opens a layer that creates that empathy that then continues to fuel everything we talked about, the curiosity, the connection, the just, I forgot how you put it, like super solution, like to get to that. So I would just add, like, bring that like human factor to be able to connect in a more personable way.
Yeah, for sure. And I think everything that we're talking about right now has that underlying theme of trust and relationship. You can't kind of be adversaries coming to the table and saying, like, yes, let's work together and kind of build that super solution together. So question out to everyone here then. For those who are listening to this right now, what are your tips and things that you've learned along the way in terms of building a really strong relationship internally and just driving stakeholder engagement around people analytics in general?
I mean, I like to think, we have the data, we have information, and that's like gold. So I think if you leverage some of that, obviously, I'm not asking you like, leak things, but because you have access to data, a lot of times, depending on the stakeholder you're talking to, there's a narrative or a vision or a view on things you have that other people just don't have. And so how you use that, how you leverage that information in your discussions becomes powerful because different stakeholders get attracted to that, right? So if you understand things about the recruitment process around recruitment talent, or if you understand things around, the way attrition's playing out or headcount or cost or whatever the case is, but or surveys, depending on your survey cycle, there's sometimes a lens around pockets of, the organization and how they're responding to things. But, when you have those like little juicy tidbits of information, that makes you quite attractive to certain stakeholders. And so I think playing with that a little bit sometimes becomes quite useful in relationship building, I'd say.
For sure. Justin or Carly?
I can go with maybe it's the moments of delight, right? It's the conversation where you do ask that sort of question that they weren't expecting, that they gained a little insight just from dialogue. It's the imperfect insight along the path where you're able to deliver early value that they didn't know was coming their way. It's following through on your commitments, like, this is what we agreed to, here's how I'm then delivering on those things. And I would say, we're in hospitality, so I think a lot about service. And I think that comes with like the humanness and the approach, but also the nuggets that I just left there. So I think it comes down to relationship, and is your customer being heard and seen and supported in the shared problem that you're working through.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything to add, Justin?
Yeah, I'd say eat lunch together. I know it's not always possible across distributed offices and everything, but maybe make time somehow like these informal conversations tend to be the way we connect. Even though we have often rigid frameworks for project deliverables and management, which can be very good in their own way, we need to have those side conversations. And then the other part I'd say is understand that like a setback or an unexpected result are not necessarily disappointing. You can learn a lot from those. And if you're trying to strive for a specific result anyway, it might be the wrong approach. You ask a question instead of saying, can we prove that X? And if you can't, maybe it's good. It's an important learning lesson to know that you can't, or that you don't have the capability to determine that unless you measure something you haven't measured. So like, yeah, don't be afraid to deliver bad news.
Fair enough. I hear you. Angela, this is a question for you because I think you and I have had this conversation in the past as well, which is a lot of times when you work with subject matter experts, especially those who are in HR, you often get the sentiment like, oh, I'm not a data person. I'm not an IT person. I can just tell you how my job is done, and that's about all I can cover. So from your perspective, is there, and how can we, I guess, two layers, is there a need to upskill or reskill our teams to collaborate with technology and data better? And if there is that need, how can organizations go about doing that without boiling the ocean in one shot?
No, so I definitely think there is. I mean, I think in the world of people data, there's a lot of, we come from this dynamic of gut instinct and people sort of going with what they're used to. And the whole, I think, push in the last 10 years has been, you need to be more evidence-based, you need to be more data-driven. So I think as a journey, I think HR has to get there. And so I think there's baseline, but I do think there's need to kind of describe maturity, right? So there's kind of like users, there's builders, right? Consumers. And so there's probably a need to have some sort of language in your organization around how to think about data literacy and the maturity of that and where people need to be. And the baseline of that, let's assume we call like a data citizen. There's probably some basic questions you want people asking, where is it from? And is it safe? And do you have the right to be looking at it, et cetera? And there's probably some basic things that everyone needs to pay attention to. So I do think that is an important thing to think about and to partner on kind of more broadly as a function. In a one-to-one sort of dynamic, or if you're on a call, as a sort of analytics leader, there's probably value in having a separate conversation. So like, for example, if I have a report that's due or I have some sort of deliverable, I might kind of prep people to receive it as opposed to sort of just showing up with it. And in that sort of lead up to to the actual sort of report, I might then start to educate around the aspects of the data and the timing of it and what it means, just to sort of preempt it. And so indirectly educating without making it formal, because, people's eyes can roll. If you were like, oh, let me invite you to this data literacy training, it's like, oh my God, get away from me. But if you're saying, hey, this report is coming, but I just want to sort of give you a sneak peek, and then you're kind of teasing it, people are more interested to say, oh, okay. And even though you don't always show everything, but you kind of are giving bits and pieces with it, it's easier to digest. It's tied to the thing that they want, so their attention span is higher. So I think those are the ways I've informally done that in the absence of maybe a broader program. And then during maybe in a call. So for example, I'm not famous for just sending you a report and like you figure it out. Let's maybe have a conversation that I'm like talking you through and explaining caveats, footnotes that nobody reads, but I still call to your attention anyway. Things like that help to sort of tie it together. Gotcha. So basically, it's almost like when your parents are sticking broccoli in your like pancakes or something, right? Like it's in there, but it might be not so obvious.
Fair enough. So what I'm hearing as a common theme to all of this is, number one, don't assume that everyone else knows what it is that you're working on as a people analytics leader or what you're talking about as an HR person. And more importantly, number two, don't assume that you know everything about the other parties that you're speaking to in terms of what's on IT's plate, how they get the work done, so on and so forth. So we're almost at the end of the session. By the way, this is a really fast hour. I do want to vet one more question from our audience here, which is, more generically speaking, how do you deal with data governance as part of data architecture? Can you design governance and security into data architecture to begin with? Whoever wants to go.
Yes. Yeah, I do a lot of that. My team's in charge of both the governance and the data engineering, and I think it needs to be considered upfront. It's one of those things, if you build it in early, it takes what seems like a big effort at the beginning, but it saves you so much work in the long run. And that means working with technology teams to figure out how can we control permissions, and working with a privacy team to determine what data should we even have, and with compliance teams to say like which data, how can we use data in which ways, and then how do we get rid of it once we don't need it anymore, which is often dictated by regulations. But the technology base, it's not too complex these days in most systems. If you can do group management and categorize your data somehow, you can say like this type of data should be accessible by these groups. And then importantly, there's also an exception process. So like an analyst on your team is going to be called in to do some analysis, and maybe they're not part of the regular team who does that analysis, but they have the go ahead from that team. Maybe it's a compensation analysis report, or like some governments require some kind of like ethnicity, like that's very sensitive data that the company doesn't want getting out for the sake of the company and or for the sake of the employees or candidates. And if you just have ways to categorize all those things that you've thought through, then you can be in pretty good shape. So building it in that way. If you're coming into a situation where you have to the systems are already in place and you need to go back, I'd recommend looking into what are the capabilities of that system while you're looking into the requirements for what you need to do. And so you're kind of learning how to use both sides of your brain or whatever at the same time, and then pull those things together.
Yeah, for sure. Angela or Carly, anything to add from your perspectives?
So just kind of just check, is this question of how do you incorporate like privacy and security into data governance? Is that the question?
It's more so, how do you design governance into data architecture, if I'm interpreting that question correctly?
Okay, because I just assume that they kind of tend to go together. I don't know that you could do the governance without understanding it, but usually, yeah. I mean, I think it's having a person accountable. I think there's probably the most important thing for companies is that there needs to be someone just accountable for data. There needs to be like people accountable for data, and then I think that's when everything kind of builds around it. I think if it's treated as a side of a desk, if someone's sort of tagged with trying to do that, I think then it's a nightmare. But if people are, actually accountable for it, there's a role, and therefore, you can assume if that person's running that, then there's going to be calls and meetings, and there's a regular cadence having those conversations, and I think all that comes through. But I've never worked at a company where that, because I've always worked at regulated organizations where data was necessarily like there was a mandate to have a role or have some sort of function around it. Whether or not they did a good job of delivering it is something different, but that's important that it needs to be there. So for me anyway, it's always kind of been there. I don't know, I've never seen it separated, I guess is where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
When I read through Stevie's question, which I think is the one you're referencing, I see like a very specific question about like the administrators of the database, for instance. Some companies will set up a separate instance so that only specific administrators can access that specific data. So like let's say you had a people data warehouse and that one is going to be separated off from the main one. Also, if you talk to your compliance, privacy, and legal teams, you might find that they're totally fine with administrators being in the mix as long as they're trained properly and there's a chain of accountability so that if there's auditing about who can access what and if there's a leak, they can figure out who accessed that kind of data. It's not ideal to have that situation ever arise to begin with, but if everyone involved understands that they can be found out, they are less likely to violate those agreements.
Yep, that is very fair. All right, so we're almost at the top of the hour here. I did promise to get you guys out on time so you can make your next meeting. So here is a hot take round for everyone because we do aim to be very practical for those who are listening to the webinars. If there's one thing you can leave our audience with today in terms of what they can do tomorrow, what they can do differently or continue doing tomorrow to get a better data or tech or a setup in their organization, what would that tip be? And whoever wants to go first, we're just going to go quickly around the table and then we'll wrap it up.
I'd say start with conversations. I mean, you don't know what you don't know. There could be a lot of things that already exist, already in place. So I wouldn't make an assumption that it's not there yet. So I would focus a lot on the collaboration. Start collaborating and having conversations with as many people in different sides of the org, both from a technology side as well as HR.
All right.
Be willing to learn out loud together. Right, there's going to be mistakes along the way. There's going to be little wins along the way, little insights along the way, getting to know each other along the way. So learn out loud. I think learning out loud brings that authenticity that builds your partnership that ultimately delivers value for what you're all trying to accomplish together.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think this goes hand in hand with both of those. Like, seek out complaints. Like throw away the assumptions or at least re-question them, because you might find that somebody does have a solution or something has changed. Maybe there's a new release of the system you're using and you can do the thing that you thought you could never do. So always ask the questions and try to find those questions if you don't have them yourself. It's not really a hot take, I guess, but
no, it's definitely a helpful reminder that we
everyone
all
work together.
Exactly.
I wouldn't just have like hot take. I have like a normal take, I think.
A regular take, yeah.
A practical take.
A regular practical take that needs to be reminded once in a way, I think. All right. So thank you all so much for hanging out with me for the past hour. I definitely really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure our audience has a lot to take away as well from the conversation. One thing that stands out loud and clear for me, especially in the prep sessions, as well as in this entire conversation, is that yes, people analytics is a lot of technology, data, zeros and ones, and how do you get technology to talk to each other, which is why we're having this conversation. But behind it all, what all of you have reminded me of today is the fact that there are humans behind this. And before you think you can get the technology and the data right, it's almost like you have to get the human component part of it right to get the conversations going, to then try to tackle the problem and fix it all together. So Thank you all so much for joining us today. And if you're listening to us in the audience, thank you all for hanging out with us for that last hour on LinkedIn Live. This recording will be available on the SPA website as well as on our LinkedIn page. And please stay tuned as we will have a announcement as to what the November event will be and the topic for that as well. So with that all said, happy Wednesday, everyone. Appreciate your time as usual and have a good one. Take care.